So what I want to do this afternoon is I want to take you on a short virtual tour through haunted Prague. I want to acquaint or reacquaint you with the beauty of this magical city and give you a flavor of its legends, which really do occur at every turn and under every turret. Then I want to talk very, very briefly of why I think Prague is the most haunted of places, and finally do a very short Halloween-appropriate reading from my book. I'll then open it up to questions. So let's see where we're going to go this afternoon. Okay, we're going to start right in the middle of the map. You see that red bridge? That's Charles Bridge across the Vltava River. Then, after visiting the bridge, we're going to go over to the right bank, touring the old town, then heading north to the Jewish town, and then down south to the new town. And we're going to focus on that large rectangle that you see outlined in red. That's Wenceslas Square. Now, once we finish in the new town, we're going to jump across the river and go to the lesser town, or Mala Strana in Czech, and then head upwards to the castle district, finally ending at the castle itself with the glorious St. Vitus Cathedral. So with that, let's begin our tour of haunted Prague. Now, as I said, our first stop is Charles Bridge. And I think this is an appropriate first stop because it is Prague's #1 tourist attraction. And if any of you have been there, say at midday, when you're shaking it, you are shoulder to shoulder with a mob of tourists, you can definitely say that that is true. But the photos that I'm about to show you here, they were taken about 8 a.m., and it's really the best time to see why the Charles Bridge is considered one of, if not the, most beautiful and romantic bridges in the world. Now, it was built in 1357 over the Vltava, and it features those gorgeous Gothic bridge towers, which are considered the finest in Europe. Of course, also features legends. For example, once an architect made a pact with the devil. He wanted to rebuild the Charles Bridge in order to gain fame and because his wife desired status. Well, as you can see, the bridge was not rebuilt. And I probably don't need to tell you that things did not turn out so well for the architect or his wife. And I never understand why anyone living in Prague would make a pact with the devil. There's a fuller account of that story in my book. But of all the features of the bridge, the most outstanding is a little of what you see here, and I have more photos, the 32 stone statues of saints that flank both sides. Here is another photo. Perhaps you can see a little more of them. And this is why Charles Bridge has been called by many Europe's finest outdoor art gallery. Now, my favorite statue of all of these is this one. Now, it happens to be the largest on the bridge, and it commemorates a Catholic religious order that was established to free Christian slaves from the Turks. In fact, you can see the Turk standing there with his scimitar. And if you look at that little cell in the base of the statue, you can see the slaves languishing. Now, the reason this is my favorite is that allegedly, 3 times in the 20th century, in 1945, when Prague was liberated from the Nazis, in 1968, during the brief flowering of freedom known as Prague Spring, which was crushed by the Soviets, and in 1989, at the fall of communism, those bars were ripped away by joyful Praguers. So that is why it's my favorite statue. But there's another photo of, you can see another couple of statues, and that, of course, is Prague Castle and St. Vitus Cathedral looming above the bridge. Now, from a certain vantage point on the bridge, you can see the back of the castle. And here it is. And we will be visiting the castle and the cathedral in depth later on. But I wanted to point this out from Charles Bridge because it's the best place to see a tower. Now, you see that little square tower in the back, the little white square tower with the red roof, that's called the White Tower. Now, directly beneath it, like you can't see it in this photo, but I wanted to put it into perspective. Directly beneath that tower is this one, that round tower you see there, and that's the Dalibor Tower. Now, during the Middle Ages, that tower was actually the castle's dungeon, and it was named for its first inhabitant, Sir Dalibor of Kozoyedi. Now, Dalibor's crime was that he had sided with the oppressed serfs against their cruel masters. Well, he was imprisoned here to await his fate. And it wasn't unusual in the Middle Ages to be imprisoned and left to languish for quite a long time before you were executed. So to while away the time, for some reason, Dalibor asked for a violin. And very, very soon after, the most glorious music was heard floating above Prague. Soon, larger and larger crowds began to gather. And the authorities became very afraid to do anything to Dalibor, at least publicly. But one day, the music suddenly stopped, and Dalibor was never heard from again. But even today, Praguers will tell you that yes, on a calm summer night, you can still hear the echoes of a violin floating above Prague. Now, I tell that legend, and not because it's particularly scary or gruesome, and there are definitely some of those coming, but because of all the legends of Prague, this one is the best loved by Praguers. And I think it's because it speaks to those things that are important to the Czechs and to, of course, the people of Prague: music, history, and siding with the oppressed. Because many times over their history, the Czechs, of course, have been oppressed by outside forces. Now, any place, of course, around Charles Bridge is just beautiful. This is the Devil's Stream, which you can see from one side of the bridge. And I have to note, though, given the name, it is probably the only place in Prague that is not associated with a legend. The devil refers to an early inhabitant who apparently had an extraordinarily wicked temper. And then on the other side of the bridge, you just see a little canal with this lovely balloon floating above it. And before we leave Charles Bridge, just wanted to show you, and this is from the right bank of the river, just the whole panorama of the bridge. And just noted that beautiful sandstone arches, again from the 14th century, with, of course, the castle and St. Vitus above it. Now, very close to the bridge is my favorite area of the city, the Old Town. And here's what I write about it in Haunted Prague. With its jumble of spires and steeples, the warren of winding lanes, dark towers, and multi-hued facades, and Europe's largest preserve of Gothic buildings, the Old Town almost seems the vision of an ethereal kingdom. Now, its centerpiece is this, the Old Town Square, where I actually had the privilege of living in 1991. Now, the square's most important monument is the Old Town Hall, which is that large tower that you see in the foreground of the photo. Now, the reason this is so important is because what it sports on its front. The world-famous astronomical clock. I can tell a few of you have definitely seen the clock. Built in 1490 by a certain Master Hanush, who allegedly used supernatural powers. It was considered a wonder of the medieval world. But even today, tourists throng the area to watch the hourly show. But you see, at the top of every hour, those two small blue windows you see there, they fly open, and a procession of the 12 apostles come past, blessing everyone in the square. There, you can see St. Peter with his very large key. And I must be honest, I'm never quite sure who the other apostle is. But once the apostles are done their procession, then a skeleton representing death rings his bell. Other figures, including a Turk, they move, they nod, more bells ring. That rooster that you see at the top, it crows and it flaps its wings, and finally the hour chimes. Yeah, honestly, it is the best show in town. And if you haven't been there, I'm joking now, and you don't believe me, here you see the tourist throng beneath the clock waiting for the show. Now, I have to note, as I said, I lived on the Old Town Square. Can you see that gray building right there in the forefront? It's almost exactly opposite the clock. That's where I lived. And I have to note, though, that the continuing tourist cacophony every hour wasn't so magical. But I always thought it was a small price to pay to live in Prague. Now, I want to stay on this photo for just a moment. The church that you see in the background, that is Our Lady of Teen Church. And an interesting note, if you were standing in the square and looked at it from a certain angle, you could actually see that the towers are not symmetrical. One is wider than the other by design. One is called the Adam Tower, the wider one, and the thinner one is called Eve. Because in the Middle Ages, this was supposed to represent the dichotomy of the world, and the Adam Tower was supposed to shield the Eve Tower from the worst of the noonday sun. That is, and you can see the towers, they are topped by, each one is topped by 8 steeples crowned by golden balls, and Praguers will tell you that this is one of the sites that inspired Walt Disney to create his original Sleeping Beauty's castle. We don't know if that is true or not, but you can take a look and you can decide for yourself. Now, the church, as you can see, also has a resident ghost, not surprisingly, of a young boy who was accidentally murdered by his own father. Now, it's a dark place in that sense, and it gets a little darker because right here, if I may, you can see a little alleyway. And if you go in that alley, you end up in, not surprisingly, Teen Courtyard, since that is Our Lady of Teen. But I warn you not to go there at night, because you may run into one of Prague's most unfriendly spirits. It's said that a Turk in the flowing caftans of the 16th century, with an enormous gold jewel box in his hands, roams the courtyard at night. Now, he was once a living inhabitant of Prague, but in a fit of jealousy, he murdered his lover. Almost immediately overcome with grief, he fled Prague and died soon after. Seemingly simultaneously, this figure of a Turk appeared in Teen Courtyard and roams there till today. But if you ignore my warning and you do go after midnight and run into the Turk, please do not ask to see what he carries in his jewel box. It's the Turk's most prized possession, but it's not a jewel that most people would covet, because inside he carries the head of his lover. And he is always willing to show it to anyone who asks, and then to add another head to his collection. And with that, I think it's time to come back out into the light. And finally, before moving on, very quickly, one of the things I love about the Old Town Square is that it has examples of the 3 types of architecture for which Prague is famous and for which it has more than any other city in the world. The first we see below the church, and that's the Gothic architecture. On another side of the square, we see the Baroque, and that is the Baroque Kinsky Palace. And then finally, on a third side, we see the glorious Art Nouveau. Of course, anywhere you go in the Old Town, you're going to see marvelous sights and hear marvelous legends. For example, just a few feet from the Old Town Square, we come here, and this is the House of the Golden Well. And again, it's Prague, so of course it's named for a legend. At one time, there was a housemaid who was ordered by her master to go into the basement and look for gold that supposedly had appeared in this well. Well, she fell in and drowned. And because her master refused to pay for her funeral, she allegedly haunts the property until today. But even better than that in terms of Prague's legends, see that crossroads in front of the building? That's where Prague's own headless horseman is said to gallop. Now, he is a former Knights Templar, we may remember them from the Da Vinci Code, who was beheaded in the 14th century for treason and heresy. And it is said that every night after midnight, he rides through this area on a great white steed that breathes fire. In one hand, he grasps a large sword, in the other, he has his head tucked under his arm. Now, if anyone is able to grab the sword and plunge it through his heart, he apparently will find peace. But until this day, no one has been strong enough or brave enough or fast enough to do so. But interestingly enough, this apparition of the Headless Horseman is the apparition that is most cited in Prague. In fact, many people will tell you that they hear footsteps in the area or just even feel a presence. But I have my own theory. You see, when it comes to the number of sightings, I also look to the number of tourist pubs that are in the area. So I'm not sure if that number has more to do with the fantasy of Czech legend or the reality of Czech beer. But it is the one that is apparently seen more than any other Prague ghost. And then just very quickly, a couple of other sites in the old town before we move on. This is the Estates Theater where Mozart premiered Don Giovanni, and Prague was by far Mozart's favorite city. And then along the river, a lovely neo-Renaissance museum to Bejik Smetana, who is the father of Czech music. And then finally, simply because I really like it, this is beautiful, authentic Renaissance doorway. But again, it's the kind of thing you can find anywhere in Prague. So nestled between the Vltava and the Old Town is the Jewish Quarter. And here we are, looking into the Jewish Quarter. Now, at one time, this really was a world apart, completely surrounded by high walls and 6 huge gates that were locked every single night. Now, the walls are, of course, long gone, but what remains is the world-renowned Jewish Museum, with the largest collection of Jewish artifacts and cultural sites outside of Israel, the remnants of the original ghetto, and probably more than anywhere else in the city, an almost palpable sense of magic and mystery, of secrets, and the golem, or Prague's own Frankenstein monster. Now, you may know that the golems are not uncommon in Jewish folklore, and they are men or creatures made from clay or mud that are brought to life using magic or the occult. But only Prague's, a giant with superhuman strength, has become world famous, which, by the way, you can very much tell from the ubiquitous souvenirs in all of the tourist shops. Now, Prague's golem was made by this man, the Rabbi Judah ben Low, and we are going to hear more about him later in the presentation. This is his statue outside of Prague's new city hall. Now, Low made the golem because he wanted to protect his people from a pogrom. Well, the golem succeeded in doing that. However, he then became so violent that he couldn't be controlled, and Low confined him in the attic of this building, which is the old new synagogue. It was built in 1270. It is the oldest synagogue in Europe, and it has continually held services since then, over 750 years, except for the 4 years of Nazi occupation from 1941 to 1945. Now, Prague's golem, as I said, is supposedly in the attic of this building, still slumbering. And in fact, this is one side. If we look at the other side of the building, can you see that staircase? You know, it's slight, but right there. That is called the staircase to nowhere. And if you notice, it really does go to an arch or a window that is completely sealed by bricks and mortar. And in another legend, it's said that during World War II, 2 Nazi officers entered the attic to investigate, and they were immediately ripped to shreds. Yes, yes, yes. Let's hear it for the ghosts of Prague. If the Old New Synagogue is the heart of the Jewish quarter, its most iconic site, however, for those of you who have been there, you will know, is the Old Jewish Cemetery. Now, the Jewish cemetery was established in 1439, and for 300 years, no Jewish person in Prague could be buried anywhere else. So in an area no larger than a city block, you have over 100,000 people buried in layers up to 12 deep. The cemetery itself is a forest of worn and weathered tombstones, many, aged and covered with moss, wildly falling over each other, some partially even buried in the dirt. Now, interesting side note, if you want the best views of the cemetery, including this photo, adjacent to the cemetery is the Museum of Applied Arts. Go into the ladies' room. I cannot vouch for the men's room, but from the ladies' room, this is where this photo was taken. just an insider tourist tip. And near the cemetery is my favorite site in the Jewish quarter. This is the outside of it. This is the Spanish synagogue. But the reason I love it so much is its interior. It is just one of the most glorious sites in the Jewish quarter. And then finally, to go from here, I think we need to end the Jewish part of this presentation on a little more somber note. Near the Spanish synagogue is the Pincus synagogue. And what you might note on the wall looks like just a series of names. Well, that's exactly what it is. It is Prague's official Holocaust memorial. And we have the name, birth date, and deportation date of 77,000 Czech Jews who perished, 85% of the pre-war population. Now, if I can leave a little hopeful note, though, this memorial was put up right after Prague was liberated from the Nazis. The communists then completely plastered it over. And when communism fell, they restored the memorial. So, on that note, I think it's time to travel south to Prague's New Town. Now, this is the cosmopolitan heart of Prague with its shops and hotels and stores, and its centerpiece is Wenceslas Square. And when you're there and you see the buildings and the abundance, it gives you a reminder that between the world wars, Czechoslovakia was the 7th richest country in the world. Yeah. Unfortunately, Nazi occupation and then 40 years of communist oppression destroyed much of their economy, but they are coming back. Anyway, so this is Wenceslas Square, and this is traditionally where Praguers have gone to celebrate or to protest. For example, at the birth of the Czechoslovak Republic, or when the Soviet tanks rolled in 1968, or the Velvet Revolution, when in just 10 days, the Czechs and their Slovak counterparts brought down one of the most repressive communist regimes in Europe without so much as even breaking a window. Now, little quirk of history. In front of the National Museum is one of Europe's great equestrian statues. And this is the Czech national saint, Saint Wenceslas. Yes, he of the good King Wenceslas Christmas Carol. Now, it was said that when the Czechs really needed him, he would come down into Wenceslas Square and save his people. Now, during the revolution, for 10 days, and I don't have a photo, but halfway down the square, there is a balcony. It's a very ordinary, nondescript balcony. But on that balcony, the leaders, the dissident leaders of the revolution came out each night to manage the revolution. And they were led by former dissident and future president Václav Havel. Well, in Czech, Václav is the word for Wenceslas. So just another wonderful little quirk of Czech history. With that hopeful note, I think it's time to go across the Vltava to the other side, to the very inappropriately named Lesser Town, because it really is one of the most atmospheric sections of the city. And it's famous for its panoramas, such as this one, or my favorite, which is this next one coming up, this centered panorama. It's also well known for its beautiful gardens. For example, if you have been to Prague, hopefully you've been to the Vertba Garden. If not, you must get there. This is the one shot of the Vertba Garden, and it's considered the finest Baroque terraced garden in all of Europe. And here's another shot of it. I just love the color. Yes, you have to, if you get to Prague, you must visit some of the gardens in the Lesser Town. And then not far from this, just one more garden. This is the massive Wallenstein garden with Prague Castle once again above. The other thing that the area is known for, quirky streets. Like this one with the little bridge. And one of the reasons I love this shot, there is nothing special about this street, nothing at all. But it just shows you that you never know what you're going to find around any corner in Prague. And finally, the last thing that the Lesser Town is known for is the largest collection of Baroque buildings in the world, all sheltered under Prague's ubiquitous red slate roofs and its green copper domes. Now, that largest dome you see there, that is the Church of St. Nicholas on the Lesser Town Square. And I really think that dome, along with the castle, defines the panorama of Prague in the minds of most visitors. So here is another shot of St. Nicholas. But I also want to note one thing. You see those two, there's actually steeples, but they look like towers in the back that have onion domes sitting on top. They belong to the Strahov Monastery, which is right down the street from Prague Castle. And Strahov has some of the most beautiful libraries in the world, which you can visit as a tourist. But it also has, among other collections, the remains of a dodo bird. A dodo bird. Yeah. Proving once again, you never know what you're going to find in Prague. And then, before we head upwards, there's one more shot, a full shot of St. Nicholas. This was taken, by the way, from the top of the Vertba Garden. I'm a real proponent of the Vertba Gardens, I admit. And here's the interior of the church. And you can see why it is considered the most glorious Baroque church north of Rome. And there also is, if you go in at nighttime, not surprisingly, allegedly there is another ghost, a young man in rags who comes every night to pray before the high altar to thank the saints for once saving his life. But I tell you, the ghost in the church has almost become ordinary in Prague. So from St. Nicholas, we're now going to head upwards to the castle area and the castle. And here are some sights along the way. Vineyards. And I love the fact that there are fully operational vineyards right in the center of a major city. So this is a little picture of part of the castle leaning against St. Vitus. And then this is the side of St. Vitus, and there's the bell tower where the former priest supposedly spends many of his days. Now, going inside, St. Vitus is justly famous for its collection of stained glass windows. And I think this is appropriate for a people, the Czechs, who first gained acclaim internationally because of their crystal and glass-making abilities, which until today is still the case. In fact, I must say I did get this crystal bat in Prague. But this is the area behind the high altar. It's called the Corona, and you can see some of that marvelous stained glass. And then one more stained glass. This is the Alphonse Mucha window. And it was designed, created, and painted. It's not a stained glass, it's actually painted, very rare, by the leading artist of the Art Nouveau period, probably the one who defined it, the Czech artist Alphonse Mucha. And appropriately, right in the center, there is a boy, St. Wenceslas, being tutored by his grandmother, St. Ludmila. Now, directly across from this window, we come to what is the most sacred spot in all of Prague, if not the Czech Republic. The tomb of Saint Wenceslas himself. This is truly where not just the national saint, but in my opinion, the national spirit is buried. And Wenceslas's remains are kept in that little house-like structure in the middle of the photo. Now, Wenceslas was renowned as a very good man. He was very pious, very generous to the poor, had a very strong Christian faith. He also tried to keep peace with his neighbors. He didn't want to go to war with his neighboring German states. That angered his brother, who was not so good, and had Wenceslas murdered. Eventually, his bones were brought here. Now, what you cannot see, though, in this photo, and it's hard to take a photo of it, period, is right beyond where the saint's remains are, there's a small door. And that door leads to a room where the Bohemian crown jewels are kept. Now, the most sacred object of the jewels is this one. The crown of Saint Wenceslas. Now, perhaps not surprising given its importance, over the centuries, a terrible legend grew up around it. It was said that any person who put the crown, any imposter, I should say, any imposter who put the crown on his or her head, even momentarily, would soon die a terrible death. Well, the legend was last tested, or perhaps proven, in 1943, when Reinhard Heydrich, who had been appointed by Adolf Hitler as Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, placed the crown on his head and left. Very shortly afterwards, he was assassinated by Czechoslovak commandos. Now, he was the only high-ranking Nazi to be successfully assassinated throughout the war. Curse? Coincidence? For the last time, I let you decide. Now, I hope those slides gave you a flavor of the beauty of Prague, and also its myriad of legends that I say again really do occur at every turn. Now, in my opinion, there are 4 reasons why Prague is the most haunted of places. The first is the city itself. You know, with its dark Gothic lanes, its dazzling palaces, its castle on the hill, it really does seem more surreal than real. And it's a city that actually does boast an alleged portal to hell, an ancient Slavic temple area, a unique pagan cemetery where all of the skeletons were found headless. And to this day, we do not know why. And not 1, but 3 Faust houses. The other reason is that Praguers have long believed in supernatural forces and figures. In fact, if you ask any Praguer, they will tell you that their city was actually founded by the mythical Slavic princess and priestess Libuscha. Supposedly, Libuscha was standing on a cliff and once went into a trance and pointed in the distance and saw a vision of a city, in her own words, whose glory would reach the stars. She then directed her followers to go to that spot and build a city, which of course we know today as Prague. In fact, the Czech National Opera, which is only performed on the most sacred occasion, is called Libuscha. The third reason, though, has to do with an actual historical figure, the Emperor Rudolf II. Now, in the 17th century, he made Prague the magical capital of Europe. He brought magicians and madmen, astronomers and astrologers from every corner of Europe to his capital on the Vltava. There they did try to turn base metal into gold, discover the philosopher's stone, and discern the secrets of the universe. More than any other figure or reason, it is Rudolf who encased Prague in that mist of legend which remains until today. The fourth and final reason is a contemporary of Rudolf, our friend Rabbi Judah ben Low. Now, although he was the leading Talmudic scholar of the Renaissance, the chief rabbi of Bohemia, the author of 22 books, and a renowned expert on education and mathematics, he lived in the Jewish ghetto at a time when Prague was the center for the study of the mysterious Kabbalah. Now that became associated with him, and unfortunately today, Lowe is pretty much remembered for his supposed occult powers, and of course for the Golem, Prague's own Frankenstein monster, which added that final little layer of things. Now, before I read to you one of the short legends from the book, I just want to note one thing about Haunted Prague. The 39 legends in Haunted Prague are not folk tales or fairy tales, but all supernatural legends, the kind I've been talking about, of which Prague is unsurpassed. All the writing is original, and I do include those newest stories, like those that are associated with the fall of communism, that aren't found in other books. I also wanted to accomplish 3 things with the book. 1, yes, to tell some interesting stories. Some are informative, some are sinister, some are funny. 2, to provide snippets of Czech history when it enhanced the tale. And finally, to provide very detailed and colorful information on the settings for each of the tales. So you really can use it as a guidebook. In fact, if you read the tales one after another, they lead directly from one to another. So again, a visitor or armchair traveler could use it as a guidebook. And with that, I'd like to read to you one short tale. I'm going to sit down for my reading, called, thank you, called The Duchess and the Demons. It's not long, but I think it gives you a real flavor. And as I said, if you remember when I showed you the photo of the Chernin Palace, this is where this is set. Now, right outside of the Chernin Palace is Prague's alleged portal to hell, where it is believed that good King Wenceslas's mother was dragged to hell. She was not so good. She was a pagan and a murderer. But when they were excavating for the palace, the workmen actually did find that unique pagan cemetery with all the skeletons headless. And 300 years later, we are still trying to figure out why. And then finally, during the Second World War, the palace was commandeered by the SS for their headquarters. So definitely the perfect setting for a ghost tale. So now, The Duchess and the Demons. In the 18th century, a widowed countess lived in Chernin Palace. Each day, she spent more on her petty desires than a needy family in Prague could hope to earn in a lifetime. She insisted that her rooms be filled with the most exceptional jewels, extraordinary fabrics, and exotic perfumes. Even when the famine of 1770 struck Bohemia, she insisted on throwing a magnificent ball. When her own treasurer expressed concern about hosting a ball when the city clamored for bread, she immediately banished the man from the palace. But the more she thought about his remark, the more an idea, a truly wicked idea, came to her. If the entire city really was clamoring for bread, then no substance was of greater value, more extraordinary, more exceptional. A smile crossed her face. Summoning her baker, she ordered him to bake her 2 perfect loaves of bread and fashion them into slippers. A single check garnet, the size of a robin's egg, would decorate each shoe. When the evening of the ball arrived, the countess waited until her guests had assembled and descended the grand staircase into the mirrored ballroom to a fanfare of trumpets. All eyes were on her because, thanks to her servants, the slippers of bread were already the talk of Prague. In a city where many would barely have a crust of bread to eat that evening, the countess had turned the food of the poor into a decadent whim. But she gave little thought to the needy of Prague as she danced with the princes, lords, and knights who had gathered from across Bohemia. She should have, because in Prague, there is often a reckoning. Near midnight, a servant came to the countess and told her that a stranger in the garden insisted on seeing her. He had been asked to leave, but refused. She was greatly irritated by the man's presumption and decided to personally order him from the palace. But as she walked through the mirrored double doors that led outside, her resolve melted. Standing by the summer house was the most striking man she had ever seen. In the light of the garden's illuminations, she could see that he was tall, with gray-green eyes and hair as dark as ebony, and around his neck he wore a great silver collar covered with rubies. "You asked for me, sir?" she queried with the slightest quiver in her voice. She was both very intrigued and slightly unnerved by this visitor. Without saying a word to her, the stranger bowed and smiled. There was a mystery about this unexpected guest, and she found herself being drawn to him. But she should have been on guard, because in Prague, the unexpected often leads to the unimaginable. But still, she offered no resistance as he walked toward her, kissed her hand, and held her in his grasp. As he did, he again smiled, but this time he appeared to sneer, and his eyes seemed to change to match the color of the rubies he wore. Now, the Countess was sure that this was all just her imagination, but a shiver ran up her spine. "Sir," she noted, this time with real fear in her voice, "I'm neglecting my other guests. Please allow me to go." Instead, the stranger held her hand even more tightly and whispered with malevolence in his voice, "Just a moment. It's almost time." "For what?" she stammered. At that, the bell in the Loreto church began to toll midnight. "For this," he hissed. A clap of thunder was heard in the distance, and the stranger underwent an unnerving metamorphosis. The Countess was no longer being held by a man, large, with huge wings, horns, and skin the color of a reptile. A demon had her in his grasp. And that was not even the most astonishing thing. Because at that moment, along with the demon, there appeared 8 more demons, indistinguishable from the first. They simply materialized in the garden. It was as though the stranger had shattered into 9 identical pieces. The Countess, of course, began to shriek, and her cries brought her guest into the gardens. What they saw could never be forgotten. One after another, the 9 demons held her in their arms and danced her into a frenzy, faster and faster, until her slippers burst into flames. Now screaming in agony, and still being danced by the 9 demons, the ground seemed to open up before her, and large tongues of blue flame leapt from the crevice. The demons then dragged the Countess into the earth, perhaps to hell, and the cleft immediately sealed. Nothing was ever heard of the Countess again, although legend tells that late at night she can still be seen roaming the halls and gardens of the Chernin Palace, her shoes ablaze. No one knows how to release her soul, and no one knows what sort of demons actually visited the Countess that night. But what we do know is that her heartlessness and haughtiness proved too much even for the evil spirits of Prague. So there is our Halloween appropriate reading for today. Yes, exactly. I mean, you do see the threads that run through legends. But I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed the tour of Prague. And I will be glad now we have a little time, as I always want to make sure there's like 10 minutes left. Any questions that you may have about the presentation, about Prague, about the Czech Republic, please feel free. My mother was actually born in the former Czechoslovakia. And I say that because we always considered ourselves Czechoslovaks. Technically, I am Slovak. She was born in Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia. We spoke Slovak. So By blood, I'm Slovak, but we always thought of ourselves as Czechoslovak. Prague was, for my mother, her capital city. So yes, so I did have that sort of grounding in this. Where I started to get my information about haunted Prague was probably when I was 5 years old. And my grandparents lived with us, used to sit me down and tell me all of these stories of ghosts and demons and witches. Luckily, I loved it. In fact, a little aside, you will probably all remember, but when I was 3 years old, my favorite television show was Dark Shadows. So you could probably see that line running through my life, but it was my grandfather who planted the original seed. Thank you for asking. Mm-hmm. Yes? Yes, I've been to Prague a number of times. I'd have to actually think how many, but I lived in Prague in 1991 on the Old Town Square, right across from the famous astronomical clock. So it was quite the adventure being there, particularly because at the time, I mean, obviously communism had fallen in 1989, but they were still, if you go to Prague now, it's cosmopolitan, it's Western, but at the time, they were still coming out of the long 40-year night of communism. So it was a fantastic time to be there. In fact, if I may, the first time I was in Prague, I was a student in London and went to Prague in 1986. It was still under communism. And someone once asked me well, what is the biggest difference? And the first thing that came to my mind, without any hesitation, I said color. So when I was there under the communist, everything was gray. The buildings were gray. The food was gray. The people were gray. But there was a feeling, I know it's hard to put into words, but sort of like, feeling a presence of a ghost. There was a feeling of grayness, of oppression. And when I came back, even in 91, when the transition was very much just happening, there was color in people's lives. There was color in the city. And whenever I think of Prague before and after, it is the color that comes to mind. Mm-hmm. It doesn't surprise me. That does not surprise me. But yeah, it was such a, and I love having, and insider here, I shouldn't get little inside information because I have not yet put in, my husband and I were just in Prague, and I have not put in the newest pictures yet. I did some tweaks. I never do the same presentation twice. But when I showed you on Wenceslas Square with the National Museum behind it, it looks so different today. That picture was taken about 5 years ago, and they've completely refurbished the building, sandblasted it all, and it is gorgeous. And one of the things I love about doing this is just showing the buildings now, because for me, it is still stunning. Yeah, they really are. But, No. It is, again, every time you turn around Prague, even for someone who's been there numerous times, I'm still, to use my husband's words, gobsmacked. To be like, what am I seeing now? And Prague is known for its legends, which is why it was like for me, it was the perfect way, and I really do talk about Prague history in the book. It's not just all, and the sites themselves. I really hope that people are using this as a guidebook, because you can open the chapters on the Old Town Square or the castle and go, oh, that's there, that's here. But it was just a fun way to talk about Prague. And I do hope, and I think if I may, two things, and I do hope the presentation did pique your interest in my book, but pique your interest in the legends of Prague, but more pique your interest in this truly magical city. But I've always thought about Prague that there is a feeling, and I felt it mostly the first time I was there when it was still under communism. You have a people, a city, a nation who has suffered so much. You know, so much domination throughout the centuries, so much bloodshed. You know, Prague is in the geographical center of Europe. Now, one way to anger a Czech is talk about them living in Eastern Europe. You know, they're like, no, we are traditionally, we have been part of the West. Communism changed that. And because of that, you know, being the center for centuries, wars and invasions and revolutions washed over them. And one of the ways that the Czech people, in my opinion, dealt with that is through their legends. Because although, yeah, there are dark stories and such, but for most of them, good will triumph. You know, the goodness, you have to keep, basically the moral of their legends is you have to keep your moral compass. If you do, eventually you will not only survive, we as a people will thrive. And for a nation that was so many times divided and conquered, that was an important message. And that's why legends are honestly so important to the people of Prague and to the Czech people overall. If you read Michener's Poland, there's just one. It's, you know, the Swedes and the Russians and then yeah, exactly. And but again, these stories help them because it's like, no, you may not be able to fight them militarily, but hold on to that moral compass. But you're absolutely right. Oh, city of the most common ones are the Rome of the North, but more than that, the Golden City. In fact, you're allowed to see, if you're in Prague, you'll see Zlata Praha, which means Golden Prague, or the best known, the City of 100 Spires. Yeah, that's the best known name. I've never counted them, but I'll give it. Yeah. But Elizabeth, I think we are right on time as usual. Thank you. Thank you. I am glad I love talking about this. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and happy Halloween. Yeah.